The storm tearing through the backwoods of Savannah, Georgia, was not merely a weather event. It was a violent, raging monster seeking to swallow everything in its path. Thunder shook the soggy earth like the footsteps of an angry giant, while lightning sliced through the charcoal sky, illuminating a tragedy unfolding in the mud. In the middle of this freezing hell, a creature was dragging herself forward, inch by agonizing inch. She was a golden retriever, but the majesty of her breed had been erased by starvation and neglect. Her golden coat was matted with clay and filth. Her ribs protruded sharply against her wet skin like the bars of a cage, and her eyes were glazed over with the terrifying exhaustion of a mother who knows she is about to die. Grace, as the angels would later call her, was not alone in this frozen purgatory. Clamped gently between her trembling jaws was a tiny, whimpering puppy, barely a week old, soaked to the bone. But the true miracle, and the true horror, was what trailed behind her. With a strength that defied all laws of biology and physics, Grace was dragging an old battered wicker basket through the thick sludge. Inside huddled 4 more puppies, a tangled knot of shivering fur. Every step Grace took was a battle against gravity and death itself. Her paws were raw, bleeding into the puddles, but she refused to stop. She was fueled by a desperate primal instinct to find sanctuary before the cold claimed her babies forever. The cruelty that led her here was the kind of abstract villainy that breaks the soul. Grace had once known the warmth of a living room, but the moment she grew old and her belly swelled with life, she was discarded like broken furniture. Her previous owners, monsters in human skin, had dumped her on this desolate road as the storm clouds gathered, driving away without a backward glance. Now, the biting wind howled through the trees, mocking her abandonment. She was fighting a losing battle against hypothermia, her body temperature dropping with every second. The world had told her she was trash, but her heart was beating with the ferocious love of a mother who would burn the world down to keep her children warm. Through the curtain of relentless rain, a faint, flickering yellow light appeared in the distance. It was a beacon of hope in a sea of darkness. It came from a small, weathered wooden cabin at the end of the dirt road, a structure that looked as tired and worn as Grace herself. To anyone else, it was a shack. To Grace, it was the gates of heaven. Her legs buckled, her muscles screaming in agony, but the sight of that light triggered one last reserve of adrenaline. She let out a low, guttural whine, gripping the puppy tighter in her mouth, and forced her broken body to crawl toward the promise of salvation. She didn't know who lived there. She only prayed they had a heart. Inside that humble cabin sat Mr. Silas, a man whom society had largely forgotten. At 72 years old, his hands were calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, and his face was a roadmap of hardship and resilience. The cabin was drafty, the floorboards creaked, and his dinner was a simple bowl of vegetable soup that was more water than broth. He sat by the light of a single oil lamp, reading his worn-out Bible, the pages soft from years of turning. Silas had nothing, no money, no family, and barely enough food to last the week. But as he read the Psalms, a scratching sound at the door cut through the roar of the thunder. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, desperate plea. Silas paused, his spoon hovering halfway to his mouth. The scratching came again, accompanied by a sound that tore at his chest. A high-pitched yelp followed by a low, mournful moan. It was the sound of a living thing at the end of its rope. Moving with the stiffness of age, Silas pushed his chair back and walked toward the heavy wooden door. He didn't have a weapon, nor did he fear robbers. He had nothing worth stealing. He unlatched the lock, bracing himself against the wind, and swung the door open. The sight that greeted him would haunt his nightmares and bless his dreams for the rest of his days. There, collapsed on his porch, lay the golden retriever. She looked more like a drowned rat than a dog. The moment the door opened, Grace didn't try to run inside. Instead, she did something that stopped Silas's heart. She gently lowered the puppy from her mouth onto the dry tip of his boot. Then, she collapsed onto her front legs, pressing her forehead against the wood in a bow of total submission. She was surrendering. She was telling this stranger, "I cannot go on. Take him. Save him. I don't matter." It was a sacrifice so pure, so human, that tears instantly welled in the old man's eyes. Silas looked down at the trembling mother, and then his gaze drifted past her, into the storm. A flash of lightning revealed the wicker basket sitting in the mud a few feet away, the tiny heads of the other puppies, bobbing up, crying out for warmth. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. This starving, dying creature had dragged her entire family to his doorstep. She had chosen him. Out of all the houses in Georgia, she had brought her burden to the man who had the least to give. But Silas knew, in that split second, that poverty is only a state of the wallet, not the spirit. "Good Lord Almighty," Silas whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. He didn't care about the mud on his floor. He didn't care that he had no dog food. He didn't care that he could barely feed himself. He ignored the aching in his knees and knelt on the wet porch, ignoring the freezing rain lashing at his back. He reached out a trembling hand toward Grace's head. She flinched, expecting a blow, the trauma of her past rising up. But when his rough, warm palm gently cupped her icy snout, she let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned into his touch. The pact was sealed. "Stop right now. Look at the sacrifice this mother just made. She dragged her babies through hell just to give them a chance. If you are praying that Silas can save them all, please hit that subscribe button right now. Your like is a prayer for their survival. Let's bless this rescue mission together. You're safe now, girl. You hear me? You ain't gotta fight no more," Silas murmured, his voice thick with compassion. He scooped up the puppy from his boot and tucked it into his flannel shirt. Then, moving with a speed fueled by adrenaline, he stepped out into the rain to grab the basket. The puppies were soaked, their cries weak and fading. He grabbed the basket in one hand and guided Grace with the other, ushering the frozen family into the meager warmth of his home. He slammed the door shut against the howling wind, locking the monster outside. But as he looked at them in the dim light, the terror returned. The situation inside was dire. The cabin wasn't much warmer than the outside. Silas couldn't afford enough firewood to keep the place toasty, and the drafts were brutal. Grace collapsed on the bare wooden floor, her chest heaving violently, her eyes rolling back in her head. She was in critical condition. She was too weak to lick her puppies dry, and the puppies were too cold to move. Silas stood there dripping wet, holding a basket of dying lives, realizing the terrifying truth. Love might not be enough. He needed resources he didn't have. This was the cruel irony of the night. The abstract villain of poverty was already in the room with them. Silas looked at his empty cupboards and his dying fire. He had brought them in from the storm, but he had no milk, no blankets to spare, and no phone to call a vet. Grace let out a soft, agonizing whimper, her eyes locking onto Silas again. It was a look of absolute trust, placing the weight of 5 lives squarely on his weary shoulders. The storm outside was raging, but the battle for life inside was just beginning, and the odds were stacked, impossibly high against them. Silas stood in the flickering light of his single oil lamp, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin felt like an icebox, the wind whistling through the cracks in the old timber with a ghostly moan. Grace lay there, a heap of wet, shivering fur, guarding her puppies with a desperate, fearful intensity. Every time Silas moved, her ears flattened against her skull, and a low, tremulous vibration started in her throat. It wasn't a threat. It was the sound of a broken heart trying to protect the only things she had left in this world. He knew he had to act fast, or the cold would finish what the humans started. "Easy now, sugar. I'm just an old man with a soft heart," Silas whispered, his voice trembling as much as the dog. He reached for a tattered towel, but as he stepped closer, Grace let out a sharp, jagged bark that echoed off the bare walls. She didn't want him near her babies. To her, every human hand was a hand that hit, a hand that threw stones, or a hand that pushed her out of a car. The trauma was etched into her very bones, making her see a predator instead of a savior. He had to prove he was different, and he had to do it before her body gave out. The old man realized he needed to bridge the gap of fear with the bridge of warmth. He went to his small bed and pulled off his only wool blanket, a thin, faded thing that had kept him warm for a decade. With slow, deliberate movements, he knelt a few feet away from her. He didn't reach for the puppies. Instead, he gently tossed the corner of the blanket toward her. Grace flinched, her eyes wide with terror, expecting a strike. But as the soft wool touched her shivering skin, she didn't feel pain. She felt a phantom memory of comfort, a warmth she hadn't known in years. Just as a sliver of trust began to form, disaster struck. One of the puppies, the smallest of the litter, stopped whimpering. Its tiny body went limp in the wicker basket. Its chest, no longer rising with the effort of breath. Silas saw it immediately. "No, no, no, not on my watch," he cried out, forgetting his own safety. He lunged forward, reaching into the basket. Grace reacted with a primal snarl, her teeth baring in the dim light. She was ready to bite the only man who could save her child, her mind clouded by the agony of past betrayals. Silas didn't pull back. He looked Grace straight in her weeping eyes, his gaze steady and filled with an ancient, fatherly love. "I'm trying to help him, Grace. Let me help him," he pleaded, using her name for the first time as if he'd known her forever. Something in his tone, a frequency of pure kindness, pierced through her defensive walls. Grace's snarl died down into a whimpering sob. She lowered her head, closing her eyes as if to say she surrendered everything to him. She let him take the tiny, cold body of her baby into his calloused hands. The old man began to rub the puppy vigorously with a warm cloth, his fingers trembling with urgency. He blew his own warm breath into the tiny muzzle, praying a silent, frantic prayer. "Come on, little fella, don't you quit. Your mama worked too hard to get you here." For a minute that felt like an eternity. The room was silent except for the howling wind outside. Then a miracle happened. The puppy let out a faint, gasping sneeze and began to squirm. Grace let out a soft whine, her tail giving a single weak thump against the floor. The crisis wasn't over, but a life had been reclaimed. Silas knew Grace was fading too. She was severely dehydrated, and her milk had dried up from starvation. He looked at his own dinner, the bowl of vegetable soup, and realized it was all he had. He knelt beside her, holding the bowl. "It ain't much, girl, but it's yours." He dipped a piece of his last bit of bread into the warm broth and offered it to her on his palm. Grace hesitated, her nose twitching. She looked at the food, then at the man, with a tenderness that could break. A stone heart, she took the bread from his hand, her tongue licking his skin. As she ate, Silas began the grueling work of drying her matted fur. He spent hours on his knees, his old joints screaming in protest, rubbing the filth and the Georgia mud from her golden coat. Each stroke of the towel was a message of love. He talked to her about his life, about the wife he missed, and about how they were going to get through this storm together. Grace didn't understand the words, but she understood the soul behind them. For the first time in a long, long time, the tension in her muscles began to melt away. Are you rooting for this angel? Your like helps save more lives. Subscribe to support our mission. Now, let's see if he survives. By the middle of the night, the cabin was a makeshift nursery. Silas had used his last bit of firewood to keep the hearth glowing just enough to stave off the frost. He sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, while Grace lay with her head resting on his thigh. The puppies were tucked into the wool blanket, finally warm and safe. But as Silas looked at Grace, he noticed her breathing was becoming ragged. A dark stain was beginning to spread on the blanket beneath her. She was bleeding, and it wasn't stopping. The trauma of the birth and the journey was taking its toll. "Lord, give me strength," Silas whispered, his face pale. He realized Grace was suffering from a severe internal complication. He didn't have a car, and the nearest vet was 5 miles away through a flooded dirt road. He was just an old man with no money and a failing heart of his own. The almost fail moment had returned, and this time it was the mother's life on the line. He looked at the puppies, who finally looked peaceful, and then at Grace, whose eyes were starting to glaze over again. She had given everything to save them, and now she was slipping away. Silas stood up, his legs shaking. He knew he couldn't wait for the sun. He wrapped Grace in a second blanket, making a heavy bundle, and looked at the wicker basket. He couldn't carry them all at once, and he couldn't leave the puppies to freeze. The impossibility of the situation felt like a physical weight crushing him. He felt like a failure. But then he saw Grace's tail move again. She was looking at him, not with fear, but with a quiet expectation. She believed in him. She had chosen him, because she knew he wouldn't give up. He began to gather his things, his mind racing. He found an old wheelbarrow in the shed, rusted but sturdy. He lined it with every scrap of fabric he possessed, creating a dry nest for the basket. Then he carefully lifted Grace's heavy, limp body into the center. She was too weak to protest. He covered her with a plastic tarp to shield her from the rain and gripped the handles of the wheelbarrow. His hands were slick with rain and sweat, his vision blurred by the downpour, but he started to push. He was going to walk to town. The mud was thick, pulling at his boots like quicksand. Every step was a battle against the Georgia clay. The wind tried to knock him over and the rain blinded him, but Silas kept his head down and his heart up. He talked to Grace the whole way, his voice a raspy chant against the storm. "Don't you die on me, Grace. We're almost there. Just a little further, honey." He was pushing the weight of 6 lives through a literal hurricane, a 72-year-old man performing a feat of strength that defied his age. At one point, the wheelbarrow got stuck in a deep rut. Silas pulled and pushed until he fell to his knees in the mud. He sat there for a moment, sobbing with exhaustion, the cold seeping into his marrow. He felt like he couldn't go another inch. But then, a small, wet nose pushed against his hand from under the tarp. Grace had managed to nudge her head out to check on him. Her eyes were filled with a desperate plea for him to get up. She wasn't asking for herself. She was asking for her babies. Silas wiped his face, stood up, and heaved the wheelbarrow out of the mud with a roar of defiance. The lights of the small town finally appeared through the trees, a shimmering mirage of hope. Silas was stumbling now, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his chest tight with a warning pain. He reached the door of the local vet clinic, which was dark and locked for the night. He didn't care. He began to pound on the door with his fists, then his elbows, screaming for help. "Please, I've got an angel in here. Please don't let her die." He collapsed against the door just as a light flickered on inside, his mission finally bringing him to the threshold of a miracle. Dr. Miller, the town's most experienced vet, swung the clinic door open to find a sight that would haunt his professional memory forever. Silas stood there, a ghost of a man, drenched to the bone and shaking with a primal exhaustion, pointing a trembling finger at a muddy wheelbarrow. "Please, doctor, help them. They're all I've got," Silas rasped before his legs finally gave out, and he collapsed into a plastic waiting room chair. The vet didn't waste a single second. He and his assistant rushed to lift Grace's limp, heavy body onto the cold, stainless steel examination table. The sterile, bright lights of the clinic cruelly exposed the raw, ugly truth of her suffering. Her golden fur was stained a sickening pink with blood, and her eyes were fixed in a hollow, distant stare that usually signaled the end. The emergency examination was a heart-wrenching litany of horrors that made the veteran doctor's jaw tighten in suppressed rage. Grace wasn't just suffering from starvation and hypothermia. She was the victim of a brutal hit-and-run that had shattered her pelvis weeks ago. She had been dragging those 5 puppies through the thick Georgia mud with a broken, agonizing body, a feat of maternal endurance that should have been biologically impossible. The vet's hands actually trembled as he felt the jagged, displaced edges of her pelvic bones beneath her skin. "She's been living on nothing but sheer motherly willpower for weeks," Dr. Miller whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of professional awe and deep sadness. The monsters who had dumped her hadn't just abandoned her. They had effectively left her to die in a slow, agonizing purgatory. While the doctor focused on the mother, the puppies were in their own desperate race against the clock. Their tiny pulses were erratic and faint, their bodies so thin they looked like miniature skeletons wrapped in damp peach fuzz. The clinic assistant, Sarah, began the delicate and frantic task of warming the litter in an incubator, her movements a blur of focused energy. The puppies were so severely dehydrated that their skin didn't snap back when touched, a terrifying sign in creatures so young. Silas watched through the glass doors, his hands clasped in a tight, white-knuckled knot of silent prayer. He had already given his last piece of bread and his only wool blanket, but now he was forced to watch as the cold hand of death reached for his new friends once again. "Silas, we need to start an immediate blood transfusion and emergency surgery. But her heart is so weak she might not survive the anesthesia," Dr. Miller warned, looking at the old man's tattered pockets. He knew Silas didn't have a cent to his name, let alone the thousands of dollars this procedure would normally cost, but before Silas could even begin to apologize for his poverty, the vet firmly shook his head and gripped the old man's shoulder. "Forget the money right now, Silas. A dog that fights this hard against the devil himself deserves a miracle, and I'm not letting her go down on my watch tonight." The clinic immediately transformed into a frantic battlefield filled with the chaotic symphony of beeping monitors and the sharp smell of antiseptic. The hours that followed crawled by like a slow-motion nightmare in the quiet waiting room. Silas sat, alone, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounding like a countdown to tragedy. He thought about how the world had treated Grace as something disposable, a piece of trash to be thrown out when she became an inconvenience. He saw his own life reflected in her. They were both old, both struggling, and both largely invisible to the fast-moving world outside those doors. He closed his weary eyes and whispered to the ceiling, "Lord, if you need a soul tonight, take mine. But let that mama stay. She's got too much love left to give those babies." His heart ached with a physical heavy weight. Suddenly the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor in the surgical suite changed to a flat, piercing, and terrifying whine. "We're losing her. Crash cart now. She's flatlining." Sarah's voice rang out, sharp and panicked, cutting through the silence like a knife. Silas jumped to his feet, his weathered face pressed hard against the glass partition. He saw the medical team hovering over Grace's limp, unresponsive body, their silhouettes frantic against the bright lights. Her heart, finally burdened too much by the weight of her journey and the trauma of her injuries, had simply stopped beating. It was the moment of maximum darkness, where it felt like the cruelty of the world had finally won the war against Grace's spirit. Dr. Miller began rhythmic chest compressions, his face beaded with sweat and focus. "Come on, Grace. Don't you dare quit on me. Your babies are waiting for you." "You!" he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. He was fighting for more than just a dog. He was fighting for the very idea that goodness and sacrifice can win against cold-hearted neglect. Silas began to pound softly on the glass with his fist, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks into his grey beard. "Fight, Grace. Fight for Silas." The scene was a chaotic, desperate dance of life and death, while the tiny puppies in the nearby incubator let out a chorus of high-pitched, mournful cries, almost as if they could feel their mother's soul slipping away into the light. For 3 long, agonizing minutes, Grace was technically dead. The air in the clinic felt cold and heavy, thick with the overwhelming scent of failure and grief. But then, a tiny, miraculous blip appeared on the green screen of the monitor. Then another. The flat line broke into a beautiful, jagged mountain range of electrical activity. Grace's chest gave a sudden, violent heave, and her heart began its rhythmic thumping once more, stronger than before. Dr. Miller collapsed back against the tiled wall, wiping his brow with a bloodied surgical glove and exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. "She's back," he breathed, a look of pure, humbled awe on his tired face. The rest of the night was a blur of tubes, warming blankets, and constant monitoring. Grace remained in a deep, medicated sleep, her body finally allowed to rest while the humming machines did the heavy lifting for her. The puppies were being bottle-fed every hour, their tiny mouths greedily sucking down the life-saving formula that would help them grow. Silas refused to leave his post in the waiting room, turning down the vet's kind offer of a cot in the back. He wanted to be the very first thing Grace saw when she finally woke up from the darkness. He wanted her to know, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the world wasn't just made of mud, rain, and pain. As the first golden rays of the Georgia sun began to peek through the clinic's front windows, the atmosphere finally shifted. The oppressive weight of the night began to lift, replaced by a cautious, fragile hope that tasted like a new beginning. Dr. Miller walked out of the back, his lab coat wrinkled and stained, but his eyes were brighter than they had been in years. "She's stable, Silas. Her fever is finally down, and the internal bleeding has completely stopped. She's a walking miracle, truly." Silas let out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief, his shoulders finally dropping from their defensive hunch. The monster of death had been driven back, defeated by an old man's courage and a dog's love. When Grace finally opened her eyes an hour later, they weren't clouded with the fog of pain anymore. They were clear, deep, and soulful. The first thing she did was try to weakly lift her head, her nostrils twitching as she searched for the familiar scent of her litter. The vet opened the heavy door of her kennel and brought the basket of puppies close to her face. The moment Grace saw them, a low, melodic whine of pure joy escaped her throat. She began to lick the nearest puppy with a frantic, beautiful energy. It was the most incredible sight Silas had ever seen, the absolute triumph of a mother's love over a cruel and indifferent fate. However, the road to a full recovery was only just beginning. The vet sat Silas down and revealed that Grace would need expensive specialized food and months of intensive physical therapy for, her shattered pelvis. The vilain abstrato of poverty loomed over them again like a dark cloud. How could Silas, a man who lived on simple soup and faith, afford to keep this entire family together? He looked at Grace, who was now resting her chin on the edge of the basket, watching him with a look of profound, eternal gratitude. He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew that a God who could bring a dog back from the dead could surely find a way to feed her. News of the golden miracle began to spread through the small, tight-knit town like wildfire. A local reporter, who had stopped by the vet for her own cat, saw Silas and Grace and wrote a quick, emotional post on social media. The story of the poor man who pushed a rusty wheelbarrow through a literal storm to save a dying mother touched a raw nerve in the community. People began to realize that while Grace was the one being physically saved, Silas was the one teaching the entire town how to be truly human again. The tide was turning, and the universe was preparing to reward his selfless sacrifice in ways he couldn't imagine. The puppies, now nicknamed the Storm Survivors, were starting to show their individual spunky personalities. There was the brave one who first survived the cold, and the tiny one who had stopped breathing but fought his way back. They were no longer just a litter. They were living symbols of resilience and hope. Grace watched over them with a quiet, regal dignity, her tail giving a soft, rhythmic wag whenever Silas entered the room. She knew she was finally safe. The paralyzing fear that had lived in her eyes for years had been replaced by a deep, soulful peace. She was no longer a discarded stray, she was a queen. The act of rescue had transformed the quiet clinic into a temple of second chances. Even the toughest, most cynical staff members found themselves wiping away tears as they watched Grace try to stand for the first time. Her legs were still weak, and her pelvic bones were held together by surgical plates and screws, but her spirit was entirely unbroken. She took one shaky, uncertain step, then another, moving toward Silas with an unwavering, loving focus. When she finally reached him and leaned her warm weight against his leg, the entire room erupted in spontaneous applause. The crisis was officially over, and the miracle was standing on 4 legs. 6 weeks had passed since that terrifying night of thunder and blood, and the humble cabin at the end of the dirt road no longer looked like a forgotten shack. Thanks to the overwhelming tide of love from the community, Silas's home had been transformed into a sanctuary of warmth and light. The roof had been professionally repaired, the drafts were sealed, and the pantry was overflowing with more food than the old man had seen in a lifetime. But the most beautiful transformation wasn't the wood or the shingles. It was the golden miracle resting on a plush orthopedic bed in the center of the living room. Grace was no longer a skeleton wrapped in wet fur. She was a radiant, glowing queen of a dog, her coat shining like a Georgia sunset, and her eyes sparkling with a joy that felt brand new. The glow-up was nothing short of a cinematic masterpiece. Grace's ribs had vanished beneath a healthy layer of muscle and soft, honey-colored fur that smelled of lavender shampoo instead of swamp water and fear. She walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of her survival, but she moved with a regal confidence that commanded respect. Her tail, which had once been tucked between her legs in shame, was now a constant, rhythmic drum of happiness against the floorboards. She had rediscovered the simple, beautiful pleasures of life, the crunch of a high-quality biscuit, the softness of a clean rug, and the absolute security of knowing that her next meal wasn't a question, but a promise made by a man who loved her. The 5 storm survivors were no longer the tiny shivering mice they had been in the wicker basket. They had blossomed into 5 rambunctious, fluffy, golden clouds of pure energy and mischief. Their little barks filled the cabin with a music that chased away the silence Silas had lived with for years. They spent their days wrestling in the grass of the newly fenced backyard, their tiny paws pouncing on fallen leaves, while Grace watched from the porch with a look of maternal pride. They were healthy, strong, and completely oblivious to the fact that they were once minutes away from being swallowed by the darkness. They were a living testament to the fact that when a good man gives his last bread, the universe responds with a 1,000-fold increase. Grace's personality had undergone the most profound change of all. The traumatized, defensive animal who had once bared her teeth in fear was gone, replaced by a Velcro dog who couldn't bear to be more than 3 feet away from her savior. She had become Silas's shadow, resting her heavy, golden head on his knee whenever he sat down to read. She didn't flinch at loud noises or raised hands anymore. She knew that in this house, hands were only meant for scratching behind ears and offering belly rubs. She had learned to trust again, a miracle of the heart that was even more impressive than her physical recovery. She wasn't just surviving. She was finally, truly living. As for Silas, the poor man was now the wealthiest soul in the county. The loneliness that had sat on his shoulders like a lead weight for a decade had vanished, replaced by the chaotic, beautiful responsibility of his new family. His health had even improved. The daily walks and the constant activity had given his old heart a new reason to keep beating strong. He was no longer a forgotten widower in a drafty cabin. He was a local hero, a man whose name was synonymous with the kind of pure, selfless love that people usually only read about in stories. He had given everything he had when he had nothing, and in return he had been given a reason to wake up with a smile every morning. The contrast between Silas and the people who had abandoned Grace was the ultimate lesson in karma. While the monsters who dumped her lived in a world of cold selfishness and empty hearts, Silas lived in a paradise of his own making. Those people might have had fancy cars and big bank accounts, but they were spiritually bankrupt, unable to feel the profound connection that comes from saving a life. They had discarded a treasure, and in doing so, they had cursed themselves to never know the kind of loyalty that Grace offered Silas every single second of the day. Justice had been served quietly and perfectly. Grace had the best life possible, and her former owners had nothing but their own hollow souls. The day finally came when the puppies were old enough to find their forever homes, but Silas couldn't bring himself to part with all of them. After a lot of prayer and a few happy tears, he decided that the brave one, the little pup who had almost died in his hands, would stay with him and Grace forever. The other 4 were adopted by local families who promised to keep the storm survivor legacy alive with love and care. Every weekend, the backyard was full of golden dogs and happy people, a community forged by a single act of mercy in a wheelbarrow. The cabin had become a hub of happiness, a place where the air always smelled of fresh grass and doggy breath. The final scene of this incredible journey took place on a warm, golden evening on the porch. Silas sat in his favorite rocking chair, his worn Bible open in his lap, while Grace lay at his feet and the pup chased fireflies in the yard. The storm was long gone, and the stars were beginning to twinkle in the clear Georgia sky. Silas reached down and stroked Grace's soft ears, his heart full to bursting. He looked out at the road where a starving mother had once made a desperate choice of faith. "We did it, Grace," he whispered, his voice thick with a peaceful satisfaction. "We're home, sugar. We're finally all the way home. Who abandoned this angel deserves forgiveness or punishment? Tell us in the comments. Leave a like if you believe every animal deserves a home. Comment Amen to bless his new life." The story of Silas and Grace is a reminder to us all that our circumstances do not define our capacity for kindness. You don't need a mansion to offer a sanctuary. You don't need a fortune to offer a miracle. All you need is a heart that refuses to look away when an angel of 4 patas is crying out in the rain. When we open our doors to the suffering, we aren't just changing their world, we are allowing them to change ours. Silas gave his only blanket, but Grace gave him a reason to live. In the economy of heaven, that is the most profitable trade a human being can